Storm Babet has affected a number of communities across the UK, with the worst impacts being seen in Scotland and the very sad loss of life in Scotland and England. I know only too well the devastating impacts flooding can have on individuals and communities, and my thoughts and sympathies are with all of those affected, and in particular with the friends and the families of those who have so tragically lost their lives in these recent days. Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to thank emergency responders, local authorities, volunteers and the Environment Agency for their tireless efforts to help communities across the country. Storm Babet brought persistent and heavy rain to the North and Midlands of England overnight on Thursday the 19th of October and through Friday and Saturday. Met Office amber and yellow warnings for rain and a yellow warning for wind were in place across large parts of England. The range was so broad due to the storm being easterly, atypical in the UK, and eastern and southeastern facing slopes took the brunt of the rainfall. This was further complicated by a band of high pressure over Scandinavia, which trapped rainfall over the north of England and Scotland. As the Secretary of State set out in the House last week, an emergency response centre was set up, and in advance of the storm, DEFRA and the Cabinet Office convened the National Flood Response Centre to coordinate the response, and cross-government meetings have been taking place daily since last Wednesday and will continue to do so this week. Meeting in advance of the storm enabled the Environment Agency and local responders to increase the readiness of flood defences and the clearing of potential blockages such as sluice gates and drains. Equipment was transferred from different parts of the country to areas that had been forecast to be most badly affected. And over the weekend, severe flood warnings were issued for parts of the River Derwent in Derbyshire and the River Iddle in Nottinghamshire. The worst areas impacted by the storm were in Suffolk, Derbyshire, Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire and South Yorkshire, where major incidents were declared. I myself, Mr Deputy Speaker, visited Bewdley just yesterday on the River Severn, where I saw firsthand how intense bursts of local rainfall had led to the Severn's tributaries putting more water into the main channel, leading to an exceptional rise in the river's level of 1 metre in just 2 hours on Friday. And when the water receded just a few hours later, the EA were able to complete erecting the putting up of the demountable barriers so that would ensure potentially flooded properties were not flooded from these incredible peak levels. And at its peak, over 300 flood warnings were issued by the Environment Agency and several severe flood warnings. The Environment Agency Floodline Service experienced its busiest day since 2015 and 16, with over 1,800 calls. And as of this morning, we are aware of 1,258 properties having been flooded, but there was also wider disruption to road and rail networks, and as well as some flooding on agricultural land, which will have impacted crops. The Environment Agency did agree to requests for early abstraction for some farmers so that they could take water out of the system to store in their on-farm reservoirs. And I would like to add my thanks to the farming communities, particularly in Suffolk, who responded so quickly to the needs of their local communities. Regarding impacts in Scotland and Wales, the House will know that this is a devolved matter. Whilst the storm has now passed, over the course of the week, rainfall will continue to fall into river networks, and the overall flood risk for England and Wales is currently medium. Significant river flooding impacts remain probable in parts of South Yorkshire, Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, and significant river flooding impacts are also probable more widely. Further rainfall is expected later this week, but not on the same scale, and it is not expected to lead to further significant flooding. 2 major incidents remain in place, South Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire. Both are moving from response to recovery. I take my role as the flooding minister extremely seriously, and I am aware of the devastating impacts that flooding can have on local communities. Local flood authorities will decide whether to initiate Section 19 inquiries, and I know that will happen in Horncastle, and is being considered in other areas. The Secretary of State has visited sites in Nottinghamshire today and met the Chief Executive of the Environment Agency on Saturday and again with me this morning, and she met them before she left for Nottinghamshire. My teams and I have been in constant communication throughout this event with the Environment Agency and all concerned, and in particular with all members of Parliament in affected areas. And whilst unfortunately some properties have been flooded, we estimate that approximately 42,000 homes in England have been protected, which otherwise might have been flooded during this incident. And this includes towns like Matlock, where the recently completed flood defence, which is a big wall basically in the centre of the town on the River Derwent, held up well and protected the town. The Member of Parliament here actually got in touch with me to share pictures to show how this was working, and it had only just been completed. The Environment Agency considers that its assets and response have been largely effective. We should also consider more widely the areas that have been protected due to flood defences that have been installed within the last decade. We invested £2.6 billion in flood defences from 2015 to 2021, and that better protected 314,000 homes all over England. And we're currently deploying more flood schemes between 2021 and 2027 in that period, with a record £5.2 billion of investment. This includes both hard defences and natural flood defences, and it includes areas, for example, Hull, where a £42 million scheme was opened in 2022, which I visited, and indeed is in the Shadow Minister's constituency. However, we know of some areas where the assets were overwhelmed, Mr Deputy Speaker, not having been designed for such rare, extreme levels of rainfall. And we will, of course, be reviewing our response once the risk of flooding has passed. And this will consider flood warning triggers and local mobilisation of assets. We should bear in mind that local resilience fora are the principal authorities for deciding and coordinating the responses, working off established protocols and existing flood risk management plans. Some of this flooding was due to surface water flooding, which is the primary responsibility of local authorities. However, we do work with local authorities, and actually a third of our current funding in our funding budgets is linked to projects for tackling surface water flooding across the country. And the government is also working to improve the local and national response to flooding, including improving surface water flood forecasting. We are investing £1 million in this, and through an Environment Agency, Met Office and Flood Forecasting Centre project, we hope to come up with some valuable suggestions and actions. Finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, as local authorities move to the recovery phase, I know that DULUC are already in contact with affected councils to assess impacts as these communities look to recover. Thank you.
Opposition front bench, Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for advance sight of her statement. Our hearts go out to all the family, businesses and farmers affected by this tragedy, but especially those affected by the tragic loss of life. I'd like to thank the emergency services and the Environment Agency workers for their tireless work around the clock to keep people safe. Over 1,200 properties have been flooded, hundreds of people evacuated from their homes, and lives lost. But events like Storm Babet are not unexpected. We know floods happen every winter. The Minister stating in her statement that assets having not been designed for such rare extreme levels of rainfall shows complacency. We know climate change is bringing more frequent and more severe rainfall events. And as I know myself from the terrible floods in 2007, where 16,000 properties were flooded in Hull, flooding has a devastating impact on people's lives. Their belongings lost, businesses destroyed. The country must be better prepared, and we need to be taking our climate goal changes seriously. It is incredibly worrying, then, that the National Infrastructure Commission stated last week, quote, "There is no measurable long-term national target to reduce flood risk, and the current target does not factor in risk increasing due to climate change." To make matters worse, 1 in 6 homes in this country are at risk of flooding, a number that is only set to rise. And according to the Environment Agency, over half of local planning authorities it surveyed rarely or never inspected new developments to check flood risk planning conditions had been carried out. And research commissioned by insurers found that almost 1/3 of homes built in the 5 most flood-prone areas were approved without a flood assessment. This government is asleep at the wheel. Why have they put homes at risk of flooding by failing to ensure local planning authorities are able to carry out essential works? As I told the Minister last Thursday, an estimated 190,000 homes across the country were under threat from inadequately maintained flood defences in 2020. Does the Minister know where these inadequately maintained flood defences are? Did any of them fail over the weekend? Does she have any plans to find out? Are any of the overwhelmed assets she mentioned these inadequately flood-maintained assets? The government has failed to get a grip on the challenges facing our country over flooding. But these risks, as I keep saying, are only going to increase. The independent review of flooding for London in 2021 noted that the inability of organisations to share data and coordinate emergency preparedness action had undermined the response to flooding. And I note that the Minister referred to the DEFRA and Cabinet Office meetings 2 days before the floods were due, but that's not nearly enough. It's time that we ended the Tory practice of waiting for disaster to strike. While the government wants to pass off responsibility to other agencies, a Labour government would establish a Cobra-style flood preparedness task force to protect communities from the danger of flooding. We will plan for the long term and coordinate central government, local authorities and emergency services to minimise the damage of flooding every single winter, importantly, before the flooding takes place. This ensures that communities have the adequate drainage systems and flood defences to protect themselves. It's time to turn the page on the Tory sticking plaster politics and make the long-term decisions to protect communities from the devastating impact of flooding. This is how we give Britain its future back.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. First of all, I would say far from being complacent. That's exactly, we are exactly the reverse of that. She suggested that we need to be better prepared. That's exactly what the whole of our flood budget is geared up to doing. That's why we doubled it to £5.2 billion. It was £2.6 billion. It's now £5.2 billion, with all of the associated flooding schemes that is delivering, both what I call hard infrastructure and a whole range of nature-based solutions as well, which are a high proportion of a lot of our schemes. And I would have thought she, for one, would have recognised this, given the £42 million that's actually been invested in Hull, her own constituency. And I visited that. I don't think she actually came to the launch that I invited her to in 2022. And the people I met were just couldn't express more wholeheartedly what this has done for Hull and how it's protected properties and how it's protected businesses. So it's actually now attracting businesses to Hull, which previously would not come because it was too risky because of the flooding. So I think that's a prime demonstration of what this government is actually doing. I would also say on asset maintenance, and we continue to invest in all of our flood and coastal defence maintenance, and we've actually dedicated an extra £22 million for maintenance in this current review period, 2024 to 2025. And actually, of course, checking assets is a critical part of the Environment Agency's work, is to keep those assets well maintained. And virtually 94% of major flood and coastal erosion risk management assets are in their target condition. And I know that actually, in addition to that, they went out, as did local authorities, when the warnings began, which was a week ago, to check assets and also to clear culverts and to clear drains and all those small things that make such a big difference to whether there is flooding or whether there isn't in our local areas. I'll just refer to the planning application issue as well. And of course, the Environment Agency give advice on planning applications where there is any suggestion that might be flood risk. And 96% of all planning applications complied with the Environment Agency advice on flood risk. And of course, it's very important that there are strong safeguards in place where there is flood risk, and there are. But of course, the planning departments have to decide whether they want to take note of the Environment Agency's advice. And we're working very hard with DULUP, and I see one of the ministers on the bench behind me on this very issue, as it is so critical to protecting our island. And finally, the Cabinet Office meetings. I would have thought she might have welcomed those meetings. We actually already have exactly what she's asking for. We do have a National Flood Response Centre with the Cabinet Office, with DEFRA, with all the various government departments engaging. And that was set up on Wednesday with all, but the warnings had already begun, the Met Office information had already gone out, and that all fed into those meetings, and that's why the system and the information was able to go out to all the people. But of course, if we can do more, we can keep more people safe, that's something we will always do, which is why we've taken note of the incidents this time, and when it's safe to do so, we will be reviewing particular things to see if we can improve people's safety even more.
Sir Robert Buckland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for her statement. The wider consequences of sudden and torrential rainfall are clearly being seen in constituencies like mine and communities like mine. I was dealing with the aftermath on Friday. This is happening much more frequently. There are two observations, are there not, to draw from this. One, the long-term planning with regard to provision of more retention ponds and understanding the flow of watercourses in local areas such as mine. And two, the short-term culvert clearing, drain clearing operations that clearly need to get better. Will my honourable friend meet me to discuss how we can better coordinate local authorities, the Environment Agency, and indeed the utility companies who also have a responsibility in this area?
I thank him for those very astute observations, and he's absolutely right about the more frequent incidents, and this is linked to climate change, there's no doubt about that. In terms of looking at the whole flow of water, that's exactly what we are focusing on through our plan for water, working at a catchment basis, which is going to be so important in future. And in terms of it's actually the role of the local authorities to keep those culverts clean and all of that. I'm going to volunteer my DULUP minister to meet with you to discuss that, because it's a very important issue.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The thoughts of myself and my colleagues are with all of those who have lost loved ones as a result of the storm. And we're also thinking about those who have lost pets or have been displaced from their homes or businesses as a result of water or wind damage that occurred during Storm Babet. I'd like to also take the opportunity to thank the emergency responders, to thank all of those working in public services, whether it's SSE or SEPA or local councils, or in fact the emergency services, who stepped up in order to protect people, to prevent risk to people, and to protect homes and businesses wherever they could. The river South Esk in Brechin reached 4.4 metres above normal levels. The flood defences there were designed to cover 3.8 metres above normal levels, so they were overwhelmed because of the extreme weather. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Scottish Government is committed to helping communities, and our First Minister, Hamza Yousaf, was out in Brechin today or yesterday to speak to those who have been affected. But because the UK Government holds the purse strings, it would be much easier for us to provide that level of protection if the UK Government was able to take financial action on this. When will the UK Government begin unlocking the recovery and repair funding? And can the Minister please commit to delivering the consequentials of that funding to Scotland as a matter of urgency?
I thank her for that, and of course fully support her thanks for all of those emergency services working in Scotland as well. Interestingly, she also named the Coast Guard's involvement in your area, and everyone involved. Heartfelt thanks, and also sympathies for those who have experienced the tragedies as well. But as I pointed out, of course, it is devolved. So I can't really comment on a lot of what she is saying. She knows it's devolved. I think I'll leave it at that, Mr. Speaker.